Hi. Hi. My name is Shelby, and this is Merrily Morbid. So, this is not my regular type of content, but I do believe that it is important and it is actually morbid in its own way. I want to talk about this because so many people go through this and they think that they're alone. And so many people go through this and they think that they're the only ones experiencing it in the way that I did. Especially because every time I would go to the doctors and I would tell them the symptoms I was having, it wasn't what was described on the internet that I would read about, and even the doctors were taken aback. So let's go back to the beginning. So in 2020, my husband and I got married. And a few months later, we decided that we were ready to start our family. I had only started, I had gone to college many, many years ago and hadn't finished my degree. I had dropped out, realizing that degree, which was in American Sign Language interpreting, wasn't for me. It went against my personality. I am not the kind of person who just pretends I don't exist. If I see something, I want to say something. And I am a very extroverted person. I want to share my ideas, my opinions, that kind of thing. Not really something that American Sign Language interpreters are allowed to do. So I had gone back to school. My concentration this time was on public health. My ultimate goal was to get a degree so I could work in epidemiology, which is the study of diseases, trying to track them down, stop outbreaks, things like that. But first, you have to get your degree in public health. You also have to take like statistics classes and things like that. But the first step was getting my public health degree. I literally just started that like what? I started school in January of 2020. And of course, we all know what happened in 2020. So, very quickly, everything changed. But regardless, we decided to keep our wedding date, even if it was just going to be my parents and his parents. By this time, I was 28. So my husband, he's like, what are we waiting for anyway? So let's just start a family. And pregnancy, for anyone who's gone through it, it's hard. It is so hard. And there's so many things you go through between the pain and the emotional turmoil, in a way. Everything. I couldn't watch a Pixar movie without sobbing. It was so bad. And as time went on, I, mentally, it just messes with you. You realize that you are not the same person that you were before. But towards the end of my pregnancy, there is a test that every woman takes, or they're supposed to, the glucose test at 28 weeks. Well, I failed mine. If you fail the first test, you have to take a second test, which is a 3-hour glucose test, where every hour on the hour, they test your blood sugar after you drink this very sugary concoction. I failed again. So I was diagnosed with gestational diabetes. I am the first person in my family to ever have had it. Since then, I've learned that my my husband's sister-in-law, my sister-in-law, had it, but I was the first person in my family who ever had gestational diabetes. So in a weird way, it felt like a failure. How was it that all the other women in my family could just have babies and they didn't have to worry about this? If you've never had gestational diabetes, you don't understand how restrictive pregnancy becomes. You have to limit your carb intake. Now, that might be fine, but when your hormones are telling you you're craving this food and you can't have it because you know that if you give into these types of, if you give into these cravings, for example, I craved Sprite. I don't even normally drink soda, but when I'm pregnant, I want Sprite. When you have gestational diabetes, your increase in blood sugar causes the baby's body to increase their insulin production. That can cause them problems, especially if they're born early and their blood sugar is high at birth. It can cause them to grow extra big if it gets bad enough. If your gestational diabetes is completely uncontrolled, it can lead to the baby not making it. So it's a very mental battle. I am craving a piece of chocolate, but if I give into that, I could be hurting my baby. That in and of itself was such a struggle. Then in May, at the end of May, I went in for my induction. I was having sciatic pain that made it difficult to sit, and so I was done being pregnant. And I went through a 3-day period when they kept trying to induce my labor. They could not get anything to happen. They completely maxed me out on Pitocin, and I was still having no contractions. Now, if you've ever had Pitocin before, they'll tell you, oh, well, when we give you Pitocin, your contractions are going to get so much worse. Or they're going to start contractions and they're going to be very strong. I felt nothing with my first baby. Absolutely nothing. They completely maxed me out and decided, okay, well then we're just going to take you off of it, let your body kind of reset for a few hours, and then we'll try again. Still nothing. And by this point, they had broken my water, hoping that that would start things. And it didn't. Turns out my body does not dilate. My cervix is pretty much incapable of it. I know this because I've had a second baby since then, and same thing happened. Completely maxed out on Pitocin and no progress whatsoever. Although I did have contractions with the second one, and those hurt like a bitch. So, regardless. So, at that point, after being completely maxed out, trying everything to get my daughter to come, they decide that, it's completely up to me. But I have a degree in public health. At the time, I was actually still in school for public health. And I am very good at reading statistics and looking at the risks and the benefits and things like that. And because of my education, I understood the risks of maternal health and things like that. So, seeing that I was already on day 3, my labor was not doing anything. I was not even having contractions. My water by day 3 had been broken for over 24 hours, which puts me at increased risk of infection, which could mean that my daughter, my baby, who hasn't even been born yet, was at an increased risk of having an infection. And I mean, these infections can get bad. This is like meningitis level bad. So I decided that, they were like, you can wait It's completely fine. We're going to follow your lead. You're not having any signs of infection or anything. But I was not even willing to get to that point. I did not even want the beginnings of a sign of things going wrong. No, absolutely not. So we decided that at that point, I was going to go in for a C-section. What I did not know was how incredibly painful my C-section would be. Now, I've had surgeries before. I have an eye condition that I've had 2 eye surgeries for. I've had my tonsils out. I have had a couple oral dental surgeries, So I was like, I've had plenty of surgeries. They're not bad at all. Give me pain medications and I'm good to go. I had never had a major abdominal surgery before. And oh my God, nothing prepared me for it. The actual C-section itself was completely fine. But afterwards, as my pain medication wore off, it was unbelievable. I have never been in so much pain before. I could not even describe it. I can tell you that from my second baby's labor, when I did have contractions, the pain afterwards was, from my first one, was completely different from the contractions of labor from the second. It was constant, excruciating pain. I really just can't even describe it. It was so bad. But that's not even, over time, it gets better. Especially as you start moving more, it gets better. And, within a few weeks, those pains, they go away. So I've never been someone who's had issues with mental health. Before, I should say. And I felt like I was failing in so many ways. So my body doesn't like being pregnant. So I had the gestational diabetes. And then I couldn't even give birth on my own. I had to have medical intervention. So after my daughter was born, my first daughter, I really wanted to breastfeed. I really wanted that bond, and I wanted to save money, energy, things like that. Well, I had no idea that it was never going to be something for me. So I would try to breastfeed, and my daughter just was not getting enough. And, when you go to the doctors, they'll tell you, well, just keep putting them on the breast and, just keep trying. The more often you do it, the more milk you'll produce, things like that. Well, turns out that isn't true for everyone. I have a condition that prevents me from being able to produce enough milk. So add that on top of not being able to, carry a healthy pregnancy, not being able to give birth on my own. And now I couldn't even feed my daughter. At the height of my milk production, I could make 1 ounce every 3 hours. To put that in perspective for somebody who's never had a baby, my 10-month-old drinks 6 ounces every 2 hours. So even a newborn, 1 ounce every 3 hours was not enough. And that was between both sides. So I just felt like a complete wreck. Like I was not good enough in so many ways, which so many new moms feel that way. Almost every mom, every good mom will feel like she's not enough at one point or another. We are all good moms. If you have to worry about if you're a good mom or not, that's a pretty good sign that you are one. So that began a whole problem. So we ended up switching to formula after several weeks of my daughter losing weight and losing weight and losing weight. So we finally switched to formula, and I had to really come to grips with it, that I would never be able to breastfeed. For some people who have never had to deal with that, it sounds pretty trivial. And now, I mean, it's kind of funny now because I'm actually glad that I couldn't. Because personally, for me, I feel like it has allowed me so much freedom. And I have no problem with washing bottles multiple times a day if it means that I can allow someone else to feed my baby. But I do, wish that I could have. There are pluses and minuses to both sides. So, completely unrelated to being a new mom and being at home for the first time, because after my daughter was born, she was born at the end of my spring semester in college. And my husband was still working full time, and he had just switched to a new job as working for a delivery company, one of the big ones. And so he was gone a lot. And I had actually stopped working to focus on, being a new mom and focusing on my college degree, finishing it up. And at that point, it was only when my daughter was about 2 months old. So this was the end of July, very beginning of August. We ended up finding out that we had a major flea infestation. If you have never had a flea infestation, you do not understand how fast it goes from we found a flea in our house to there are thousands of fleas. I mean, I even looked it up, and they said that a full-on infestation can take less than a week. So we were vacuuming multiple times a day. We were bathing our cats, because we have 2 cats. Indoor cats. So we have no idea how they got fleas in the first place. We never let our cats outside. So it wasn't even in our minds that this could have been the problem at first. So we were, doing everything. We had even bug bombed the house, and it was just a constant thing. We were using diatomaceous earth and spreading it throughout the whole house and vacuuming it up, and it was a nightmare. So at this point, we decided to contain our cats to the living room area. And we, me, my husband, and my basically newborn were basically living in the bedroom, trying to keep the flea infestation to a minimum from one side of the house to the other, which I will tell you, it doesn't really work. It does not work. But it took months. Eventually, towards, I think, March, we finally got rid of the flea infestation by ripping up carpet in the house. But I will actually talk about that experience a little bit later, because that is actually part of the whole story of postpartum anxiety. So, about 2.5 weeks after we find out that we have a full-on flea infestation, and we can't even afford to hire exterminators. Like, we are not, my husband works for this delivery company, and I'm not working at the time, and I'm a college student, so we cannot afford an extermination company. So we're just trying all these, store-bought remedies. 2.5 weeks after we find out about this full-on infestation, I turned 30. So I had my daughter at 29. And 2.5 months after she's born, I turn 30. Now, I remember that it was the day before my birthday that I had my first full meltdown. So I remember being in the nursery, and I think I was putting my daughter down for a nap, and I had this thought that I'm getting older. Tomorrow's my 30th birthday, and, time just keeps going and going, and someday my daughter's going to get older. And if you've ever had anxiety, you understand that once you start on this anxious thought path, you can't stop it. You cannot stop it. And so it was completely, I've never experienced anxiety before in my life. So I walk out of the bedroom and I just start bawling. And even as a child, every once in a while, I remember having those thoughts like, someday I'm going to die, or someday my parents are going to die. And, I remember going to my mom as a very young kid and just crying, and she would tell me, well, that's a long ways away. Yes, we all die eventually, but that's a long ways away. But when you're an adult, you realize that our time is actually pretty limited. It isn't that long away. We live such short lives. And so I remember coming out and just having my full-on meltdown, and I had no idea that one meltdown about growing old someday and my daughter growing old someday would begin essentially the worst year of my life. Now, postpartum anxiety is anxiety that begins within a year of giving birth, but most people, they give birth and it's usually within several weeks. I completely was blindsided. Especially most people who have had anxiety before can, it's believable that you're going to have it again, or it just was completely out of the blue for me. My sister has had anxiety, but I never understood how, with anything, you can never truly understand it until you've gone through it yourself. So I remember coming out of my daughter's bedroom and crying to my husband and, having that same conversation like I had with my mom. That's a long ways away and we'll be okay. And that's just what it was. I eventually stopped crying. But then it happened again the next day. And the day after that. And the day after that. And within a month, I realized this is a very big problem. Because I am having daily breakdowns about dying. Now, most people who go through postpartum anxiety actually have anxiety surrounding their children. So they worry, what if I drop my baby? What if my baby chokes? What if just things like that. I did not know that there were other ways that postpartum anxiety could affect you. And so having postpartum anxiety that centered on my own mortality was, I had no idea. And that's really the number one reason why I'm sharing this, is because I don't want other people to feel as alone as I did. Now, so it was September, about a month later, that I finally went to my doctors And I was in there having my daughter's 1 month appointment, and I remember my mom came with me. My mom is like my best friend. And so we do a lot of stuff together. And so she came with me. And when they asked, well, your baby's doing great. How are you doing? And my mom's like, well, tell them how you've been feeling. And as I began to say, well, I've been having, anxious thoughts around death, suddenly the floodgates opened. And I let them know that I have been having like daily meltdowns about dying, and that I was also having guilt over having had my daughter, because it wasn't fair of me to have her knowing that someday she would grow up and she would also pass away. Anxiety doesn't have to make sense. And I just felt so guilty that I had her for her only to live a limited life, that someday it wasn't infinite. So at that point they decide, well, let's try some medications. And so I started on one medication, and I think it was sertraline. And as time went on, it still wasn't enough. And so I'd bump up, and it wasn't enough. And I'd bump up, and it wasn't enough. And by this point, I am someone who had always believed in the afterlife. I'm not religious, but suddenly with my anxiety, it was like all that was washed away. And the things that I'd always believed weren't true any longer. So suddenly I was filled with this fear that when I died, I would just cease from existence. And I mean, this is something that I still have to deal with today, because I've recently had my second daughter, and I'm still dealing with some anxiety. I'm still on medication. It's definitely much better than it was the first time around. It is completely mild compared to the first time. But it just continued to get worse and worse and worse. And when I say it got worse, I mean I couldn't do anything without the fear of dying. I could not watch my favorite TV shows. I love crime shows. I remember, I would watch things like Law and Order and NCIS and just the CSI shows, Criminal Minds, everything like that. I suddenly could not watch any of those. I couldn't listen to the radio because a song would come on by somebody who had passed away, like, for example, Janis Joplin. I remember hearing one of her songs on the radio, and I had to turn off the radio because I knew that she had died at 27. Well, at this point, I was 30. How dare I live longer than her, And it would just be a reminder, like, oh, she died. I'm gonna die. I remember being at a store one day, and my mom was actually watching my daughter, so I was able to get out on my own. I was trying to relax, just go shopping. And I remember everything was kind of fine for the first while, and then I got in line and I was waiting, and then I started having a panic attack. And I could not understand why everyone around me was acting normal, having a good time, talking with other people that they were with, as I am having a breakdown in the store, thinking to myself, as no one knows that I'm having these thoughts, how can you be so calm? We're all going to die. I do not understand how you can be so calm right now. And what do you say to yourself? What can you do? At this point, I couldn't even drive without thinking, well, if I stop too fast, somebody's going to rear end me, and then I'll be pushed into the car in front of me. I couldn't sleep because I was afraid to go to sleep, because my new big fear had become dying in my sleep, not knowing that it was even coming, that I would cease to exist without even knowing that I would cease to exist. And I cannot tell you how many times that I would wake up in the middle of the night. A lot of women will experience that after having children, especially right after. Your bladder doesn't work as well. And so you have to go to the bathroom more often, even after the baby is delivered. And so you wake up in the middle of the night to go to the bathroom, and in the quiet, in the darkness, it reminds you of what could be. I would be sitting there trying to go to the bathroom, trying to keep the lights dim so that I don't wake myself up. But the quiet reminds you of nothingness. And I would then have full-on meltdowns again. I'm talking almost every single night. Every single night I would wake up in the middle of the night to have to go to the bathroom, and I would have full-on meltdowns. I cannot tell you how many times that I sat on the floor of my bathroom as my husband slept in our bed and my daughter slept in the next room, and I sobbed because I was afraid to die in my sleep. And then I remember so many times I had been incredibly lucky. The first time I ever lost somebody that I loved, I was 26, 27, 28, something like that. I was in my late 20s, and my grandfather passed away. Well, I remember so many times, I mean dozens and dozens of times, sitting on the floor of my bathroom, 2:00 in the morning, begging my grandfather to give me a sign from the other side that everything was okay, and that when I die, I'm not just going to fade out of existence. And then, that would then turn into the daytime. And I couldn't do anything. I was having multiple breakdowns per day. I remember going to my husband and my mom and my sister and just crying to them, telling them I miss the person I was before postpartum anxiety. And I want to be that person again. I don't want to keep living like this in constant fear of dying. And it is just such a hard thing to describe to someone who's never felt that before. Going back to when I mentioned the flea infestation, we decided that we had spoken with our landlord because we rent, and we decided to take out the carpet in the living room because that was really the only thicker carpet that we had in the entire house. So we decided, okay, well, let's just tear it up. So he came over to help us tear up this carpet so we could hopefully get rid of the flea infestation. Well, while him and my husband and I were trying to tear it up, I suddenly, for no reason, completely unprovoked, start having a panic attack. And so I go into the kitchen while I can still hear my husband and the landlord just talking. And they have no idea that I am standing over the kitchen sink, hyperventilating, just feeling like any second I'm going to die. I was out of it. I could not stop the thoughts. And that's the thing with anxiety, is once it starts, it is so incredibly difficult to stop. And so I was able to kind of talk myself down. I'm a very scientific kind of person, so I told myself, well, we don't know. I mean, this is crazy, but, the same kind of way that a religious person will remind themselves of a God. I was sitting there in the kitchen, standing over the sink, thinking, well, we don't know what caused the Big Bang. There could be some sort of higher power, or, maybe our world is the other side of a black hole or something like that. And so I was able to kind of, in a weird scientific kind of way, talk myself down. But it continued for months. We eventually got rid of the flea infestation. Between removing the carpet and daily baths for the cats, we ended up shaving them, and we ended up using a very specific type of medication. So we were finally able to get that dealt with. So we were finally able to resume life in the other parts of our house again. But you also have to remember, this whole time, not only are we living inside of our bedroom, but this was during COVID, where people were still being limited to what stores were open, and nothing was open socially. So not only was I living in one room of our house at that time, but nothing was open. There was no place I could go to get out of the house, to, expand my little tiny world where I constantly felt barrages. And so eventually it was almost like a miracle. After multiple daily breakdowns from August of 2021 to May 30th of 2022, daily breakdowns, multiple breakdowns a day, not being able to sleep, being afraid to sleep. That day, May 30th, 2022, I had my last breakdown in the car, driving to my daughter's first birthday party. And at that time, I couldn't even deal with holidays and birthdays, because it was just a reminder that time is progressing. And my daughter was turning 1, and then after 1 comes 2, and after 2 comes 3, and eventually she'll be 50, and eventually I'll be 50, and then I'll be 70, and then it ends. So I remember having that breakdown in the car, and just some weird blanket lifted off of me that day. And that was the last mental breakdown, full mental breakdown, that I had had in that first year after my first child was born. I would end up having anxiety again during my second pregnancy, and I would end up going back on anti-anxiety medication during pregnancy, and then I've had a little bit of it. I live in a state where we ended up having our first mass shooting. It never happened in our state before, and I ended up having a meltdown that day. Especially because some of the victims were friends of family members of mine. And one of the victims was a very good friend of my brother's, One of them was the father of one of my niece's friends. I mean, yeah. So I remember having a meltdown then. It's like you can't even feel safe in our state, and it's a very, very low crime state. So, yeah, it's something that I still deal with. It is nothing like it was that first year, but I just don't want people to feel alone like I did, because they don't talk about postpartum anxiety in terms of your own mortality. It's usually all centered around your child's life and their health. So I just thought it would be really important to share, especially since there's so many stigmas wrapped around mental health. And a lot of people don't know that just because you've never dealt with mental health issues doesn't mean that it won't affect you someday, or someone very close to you, whether it's your best friend, your sister, your wife. So if you watch this whole thing, thank you for hearing my story, and I hope that you've learned a little bit something from it. Whether it's how to understand someone you love a little better, or if you yourself are dealing with postpartum anxiety, that you are not alone. I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.